In 1994, they stopped calling these elephants, and in a little under,
Unmute so that.
I did.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just joking. Bad joke.
Oh.
In about 2 decades, the elephant population doubled. And as a result of this, you can then study, well, how has this change in the elephant population affected the ecosystem? And one thing that you can see from this nice picture, there are not many trees in the landscape, and the ones that are there are pretty scraggly and sad. So we wanted to figure out, okay, how's the change in the elephant population affected? There we go. Affected carbon in the ecosystem. And to do this, we leverage just these incredible sites within Kruger National Park, the experimental burn plots. And they're distributed across Kruger. They span a large climate gradient. And within each of these landscapes, they have 4 replicate areas that receive about 12 to 14 different fire treatments. So one of the best replicated ecosystem level experiments that I know of, and they've been measuring the system since the mid-1950s. So what we were able to do is compare woody biomass carbon changes in the period of lower elephant density, so pre-culling or pre-ending of culling. And what you can see is that in many of the sites, they either weren't changing in carbon stocks or they tended to increase woody biomass carbon. But when you flipped on the elephants and the populations increased, you observed these large losses. And so you can look at this, and people that are carbon nerds like myself, this is a pretty big number in terms of megagrams of carbon per hectare per year. But you just have to spend about 5 to 10 minutes watching these things. And this is a tree that's about 9 meters plus in height, and this elephant ripped it down so that its baby could eat the top of the tree. So they can have large effects very quickly. In this case, reducing tree biomass likely has a positive effect, because when you see woody on things like biodiversity, because when you see woody thickening in savannas, you exclude a number of species, both plants and animals, that are adapted to the open environment. So taken together, our findings demonstrate that both plant and soil carbon storage are more sensitive to fire in drier areas, which suggests that carbon dioxide removal projects in dry lands, either in the soils or in tree biomass, are likely to be especially at risk due to fire. And this is important because many of the areas earmarked for afforestation or even reforestation, depending on the assumption of what that area used to be, especially in Africa, they're in dry lands. Now, when we considered herbivores, we found that rises in the population can really undo a lot of the gains in carbon and tree biomass that had accumulated over the course of 40 years when the elephant population was kept lower. But this is also important for thinking about in terms of management, because a lot of areas in Africa, even national parks like Kruger, are thinking about carbon credits and carbon sequestration as a way to finance the park. And so if you have the conservation of something like an elephant being potentially at odds with the amount of carbon and the revenue that you get from that, it can lead to maybe some perverse incentives. So now I want to transition to identifying what are some viable nature-based climate solutions. And for this, I'm going to be focusing on dry lands. And that's because they contain about half of the global soil carbon storage potential from implementing nature-based solutions that's been estimated using the previous estimates and studies that I talked about before. And this high potential is largely because these systems have been historically chronically disturbed. And as a consequence, they have lower potential carbon storage currently than they might have, which is a very big assumption. And just some examples, about 70% of global burned area occurs in drylands. This is a map fire frequency over 2 decades. And you can see that especially in the drylands in South America, Australia, and Africa, you see the most frequent burning. Now, you also see similar patterns when you look at the distribution of grazing lands. And the reason why fire and grazing by herbivores are interesting from a nature-based solution standpoint is because you can't just shut them off. And that's because you need to maintain ecosystem functioning, like biodiversity or potentially reducing wildfire risks. So you can't totally exclude fire. And you need to maintain food production. What are you going to do? Cull all the livestock in these drylands to store carbon? That would have a large negative effect on human livelihoods. So we were really interested in trying to understand, okay, what are some viable nature-based solutions using these 2 disturbances in drylands? And the first solution I want to talk about is intermittent burning. In this previous global meta-analysis that we conducted, we demonstrated that fire and frequent burning for multiple decades can on average reduce carbon in the soil, but this varies quite a bit across the ecosystems that you look at. With some systems like coniferous forests, even increasing in soil carbon, there's a lot of variability here, but many of the sites saw significant gain. Some sites not changing very much, like grasslands, but then other sites really pushing the declines. And what this led us to think about was, okay, why are you seeing gains in soil carbon in places like coniferous forests? And can we manage fire in those areas to sequester carbon, which also has a number of other co-benefits like reducing wildfire risk, maintaining biodiversity. And what I'm showing you here are just 2 pictures from some of the fire plots I worked in outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. So the mountains in Arizona, where with intermittent burning, it's a beautiful forest. You have open canopy cover, nice herbaceous cover, whereas you go to the fire exclusion and it's a ton of these juvenile, they call it a pole forest, a ton of these juvenile trees, basically no grass, large mat of needles. And one of the big observations in these intermittently burned plots is you have this large layer of charcoal and pyrogenic carbon. And one way to potentially increase soil carbon is by having a lot of pyrogenic carbon because it's very difficult to decompose. This is, the fundamental physicochemical reasons why biochar is one way to store carbon. And so we tested this across a range of plots. I'm just showing 4 here, but I sampled 12 different sites. And I'm showing some sites in coniferous forests as well as different ecosystems. And what you're looking at is the concentration of pyrogenic carbon relative to the total soil mass in infrequently burned plots relative to fire exclusion plots. So there are 2 things to take away. Number 1, there's pyrogenic carbon even in the unburned plots. That makes sense because all of these systems burn naturally. And number 2, you see the highest concentrations of pyrogenic carbon with infrequent fire, especially in the coniferous forests. So after we analyzed these soils, we said, okay, this is really interesting. Now we want to understand if this is actually coupled with reduced decomposition. So what we did is we measured decomposition potential, but we assessed extracellular enzyme activity. So the reason why we used extracellular enzymes is because these are enzymes that microbial species release that break down different forms of organic matter. And the nice thing about that is you can say, okay, I think that this compound of soil carbon is going to be more recalcitrant. And as a consequence, I want to measure this enzyme that targets that compound to see if it changes. And sure enough, what we found is that in coniferous forests, where pyrogenic carbon increased the most, you saw the largest relative decline in this decomposition potential. And so this led us to propose that, well, you may see increases in soil carbon because of increases in the durability of the carbon that remains. And we measured a load of other things, microbial community composition, we did lab incubations, we used radiocarbon measurements, and they all came back with similar sort of anecdotal points that there's lower turnover of the soil carbon. But it's one thing to go from what's happening in a tiny core of soil to making claims about, okay, does this actually lead to net CO2 sequestration? And so one thing that we're doing is that I'm doing in collaboration with a group at the University of Minnesota, is they run a long-term ecological research site. This is something that the US has to fund multi-decadal experiments. And this is in Cedar Creek, so in Minnesota. And a claim to fame for Cedar Creek is this is where a lot of Dave Tillman's work on biodiversity and ecosystem functioning was done. But in addition to the biodiversity plots, they also have incredible fire manipulation experiments. And so what we're doing over the course of about 6 years is we're trying to balance the budget. We're trying to understand how much carbon is going into the system, how much is coming out, and where are the sources across a number of these different fire manipulation plots. So that'll take some time, but hopefully we'll be able to actually figure out if fire's reducing the loss of carbon dioxide when plots are burned intermittently. But another integral disturbance in all of these ecosystems that burn is herbivory. So not just elephants eating trees, they're kind of the sledgehammers of herbivory, but they're also browsers because they're eating trees primarily. But also herbivores that eat grass and herbaceous biomass, and so these are grazers. But when it comes to landscape carbon sequestration at sort of the teragram or gigaton scale, managing grazing of wild herbivores is less relevant than managing grazing of livestock. So sure, as I mentioned before, there are national parks in Africa that are thinking about using carbon credit schemes in managing herbivores to sequester carbon, but I'm not going to touch on that today. And one thing that's really been proposed is that managing livestock grazing in agricultural systems is a potential way to store quite a bit of carbon. You see it coming up in corporate commitments. Cargill, for example, has soil carbon sequestration in grazing lands as one of the things in their sustainability reports. So we're evaluating how optimal grazing changes carbon dioxide removal by using a very similar approach. So experiments that manipulated the disturbance. They manipulated grazer density in rangelands. And so we classified these areas as where herbivores are getting most of their food historically from forage and mostly from grass. So we're not looking at intensively managed pastures or feedlots. And this overall project on adjusted herbivory and sequestering carbon is really being driven by two people in my group. Robert Powell, PhD student, right here. He knows all the specifics of this project. And he's leading the synthesis work. And then also Courtney Currier, who's a postdoc. And Rachel was talking about this grant from the ERC. She's leading this big survey of about a dozen sites and is in Colorado right now. But one of the really cool things about this data set that Robert has put together is in each of these sites, they've manipulated grazers and they've measured not just changes in soil carbon, but also changes in plant biomass to really try to test this hypothesis of, okay, we're sequestering more carbon in the soil or we're not, largely because of this change in plant biomass inputs into the soil. So what did he find? Well, first, he wanted to understand what are some of the main variables predicting how much soil carbon may change when you alter grazing. And to do this, there are a number of methods employed. Here, what you're looking at are the results from the machine learning model, specifically a random forest. And on the y-axis, you're looking at the variable importance plot. So these are variables that predict the magnitude of grazing effects on soil carbon. And these are just the top variables in the top model. And then these graphs on the right are showing you partial dependency plots. So it's holding the other variables constant and just varying one variable of interest to show the relationship between how much soil carbon changes and that variable. And what we found is you see the soil organic carbon concentration popping out as the top variable. And that's really interesting because from a theoretical standpoint, it makes a lot of sense behind this idea that soils can become saturated in how much carbon they store. And indeed, when you look at this partial dependency plot, you see the greatest amount of soil carbon gains in the areas with the lowest soil carbon concentrations. And what popped up next was plant biomass change. And here you see a similar type of trend where there's a rise, but then it begins to saturate. And this again makes sense from our theoretical expectations in that as you begin to increase biomass inputs into the soil, you have things like the decomposer community that starts to grow and keep up with it, and you see diminishing returns. So you can look at all the other variables that were important, but what we concluded from this is that CO2 removal in soils is greatest when soil carbon is low and plant biomass change is high, which you tend to see in areas that have been grazed very heavily historically. There's other, for all the soil people out there, there are other important indicators like soil nitrogen, soil compaction measured by bulk density that all point to similar trends of more degraded soils sequestering more carbon. But to estimate the potential to sequester CO2 across rangelands, we needed to quantify the amount of grass biomass being consumed relative to the amount of grazers present. The meta-analysis told us, okay, you really need to figure out what is the grazing pressure historically in order to estimate how much soil carbon you can gain when you change it. And so to do this, Robert compiled a number of different data sets, including the IPCC Tier 2 models of livestock food demands. And he combined this with gridded data on livestock population sizes. So this is centered around 2015, with each of these grid cells here showing you an area of rangeland that fit our criteria. And then when you compare that to the amount of biomass production in that area, you can calculate the relative stocking density. And so immediately mask the map to say we're just going to be looking at areas that have intensive grazing pressure. And then what you can do is you can estimate the amount of biomass demand in that area using things like the herbaceous biomass that's there, its amount, the composition of feed that area may be, that livestock in that area may be receiving. And this is done with additional data sets. And I'm going to be talking about the feed aspect and supply chain emissions in a little bit. And so when we mapped the potential to sequester carbon across rangelands, we found really surprisingly low global potential. And we've been struggling with this for the last few months for two reasons. First of all, our results differ a lot from previous studies, especially one that was just published this year, partly because previous studies haven't really accounted for things like spatial autocorrelation. And when you begin to account for that, you become much more limited in the confidence in your ability to predict that soils will sequester carbon. But more importantly, in this case, a large amount of the area of rangelands, historical grazing intensity may have just been too low. There may be a large amount of livestock, but it could be very productive grassland. And as a consequence, even if you were to reduce the livestock, you wouldn't see large enough gains in something like plant biomass to sequester soil carbon. So applying this across the area, and when you sum it up, you have a relatively small flux, and it's substantially lower than prior estimates. Let's get into feed. So one thing that we wanted to do was understand what it would take in order to not remove or reduce livestock production in each of those areas. So we're not just culling all the livestock, we're saying, okay, we want to supplement the amount of energy that a livestock may be getting from grass with feed. And so in order to do this, we leveraged data sets on where the feed was coming from, the feed mix within a country, and then distributed that to estimate, okay, how much feed is being consumed. And because Robert had integrated these IPCC tier 2 equations, you can look at how the transition to feed affected other things like greenhouse gas emissions. And in this case, you're looking at 3 different bars. The first is current emissions. And this is the distribution of livestock across all of these areas and their emissions from nitrous oxide and methane in their manure, as well as enteric fermentation. And then you can see when you transition them to feed, you see you're saving a little bit of those direct emissions from livestock. They have a higher growth efficiency, and there are other processes happening that reduce things, especially enteric fermentation. And just to put this in perspective, this is the drop that you get if you just reduce that livestock population size. But I don't think that's really a feasible or right outcome. But to feed these livestock, you need to evaluate the emissions from that feed. You need to understand where it's coming from. And so we're using a number of different methods for this in different data sets. But the gist of it is that in each area, and this is at the country scale, but redistributed onto the areas that we're analyzing, you need to understand how much and what type of feed, where the feed is coming from. So things like global trade tables, and then emissions associated from land use and on-farm productions of the feed. And the emissions from land use and on-farm production of the, on-farm production of the feed, we're leveraging model runs from the Blue model. It's a bookkeeping model that uses historical land use change data, as well as some FAO emission calculations. It's a lot of these runs are coordinated by Steve Davis at Stanford, and they've been published recently. They're used in the Global Carbon Project. So this is an established model. And so we're able to say in an area, what is the carbon intensity of the production of a crop that would then be used for feed? And just to give you some idea, you can look at the global distribution of these. This is just land use change emissions to grow cereals, for example, based on the Blue model. And the important thing in this sort of not back of the envelope, but sort of toy calculation is that when you begin to add up the emissions from feed required to supplement the livestock diet, they're no longer getting energy from grass, that exceeds the amount of carbon dioxide that you're sequestering in the soil, as well as the carbon dioxide equivalent arising from a reduction in livestock emissions. And this has taken over 11 years because that's the average duration of these experiments in our data set. So there's a number of assumptions that we're making. We're not accounting for things like changes in trade or perhaps displacement of different production of feed. But we think it's relatively reasonable just by looking on the scale of a decade. And if nothing else, this should give us pause of when we're evaluating nature-based solutions due to soil sequestration and grazing lands. Don't stop here. So from this, we can conclude that there are some promising nature-based solutions in drylands. The first is the intermittent use of fire and help increase the durability of soil organic carbon. I haven't talked about remote sensing, so David's leaving. Now, whether this leads to a net removal of CO2, we're in the process of testing that. For grazing, we found that, sure, you can store more carbon in particular rangelands, but historical context mattered quite a bit, as well as assumptions around how much you need to supplement the livestock diet and the carbon emission intensity of changing that diet. So I think this is an area that is definitely an active research area and something that can really help improve our estimates of nature-based solutions in these systems. So I presented our synthesis work on grazing, but we're also conducting a large survey of field experiments that manipulate both fire as well as grazers across a number of sites distributed throughout the globe. And this is being led by my postdoc, Courtney, and then we have a technician, Christian. So now I want to move on to the final part of my talk, thinking through are ongoing solutions effective? And for this, I'm going to be talking about regenerative agriculture, thinking about the net emissions from that. And it's based on no data, actually. I don't know what happened. I think it's the PC Mac conversion. You'll have to imagine that we actually have very good representation. It's one of the most impressive maps that you've seen. And to do this, we conducted both a meta-analysis to get at changes in soil carbon on a particular farm due to regenerative agriculture, as well as life cycle analyses to figure out what are the net greenhouse gas emissions arising from the transition to regenerative agriculture. And this is 330 sites with almost 4 grand observations of yield and soil carbon. So we restricted these sites to also have measurements of yield, partly because Dave Incarnation, the PhD student leading this, as well as Saryu, the researcher, they're very interested in economics and farmer livelihoods. And I encourage you to talk to them afterwards. And so we're looking at 4 crops, sort of the heavy hitters here in terms of food production. And then a number of different methods. So cover crops, minimum tillage, residue retention, and crop rotations. So what we found, and for this, I'm zooming in on rice only and residue retention only because it gets complicated very quickly. And there's 2 things to take away from this. Well, first I'll explain the graph. On the x-axis, you have the crop yield response ratio. So this is the yield in the regenerative treatment relative to the yield in the non-regenerative treatment. And then this is plotted against the soil carbon response ratio. And there's a pretty weak relationship between this. So they're clearly not increasing concurrently in a predictable way, but 69 of the sites experienced increases in crop yield as well as increases in soil carbon. So even though they may not be equal increases, I would say you're getting gains in both. You only see losses in both in 5%. And then there's sort of mixed returns on either soil carbon or yield in about 26%. Now, this is encouraging, right? You're potentially storing carbon, you're increasing yield. One of the other things that we wanted to evaluate is, okay, are you accumulating that carbon through time? Is it actually an accrual? And this is important because carbon payments assume there's some accrual of soil carbon through time. And this is a big area of debate. And so what we found is when you plotted the duration of the study and the soil carbon difference between the regenerative treatment and the conventional treatment, you tended to see greater absolute differences in the studies that have been going on for longer. Now, I wouldn't necessarily place a bet on this trend with an R-squared of 0.21. However, one thing that I think is interesting and convincing is that your confidence that you're gaining carbon increases, right? So this lower bound is going above that 0 line. So the longer you would have something like this project in place, maybe the more confident you could be about sequestering carbon. But to place this in the perspective of net emissions, especially from a farmer or a landowner or a greenhouse gas budget of a country, you need to consider the entire system. And in this case, I'm telling you about emissions within the farm gate. So this is considering things like, what are the emissions required to run this instrument that's going to inject the residue into the soil? That takes fuel. Are there any extra energy expenditures? Are there extra fertilizer applications, et cetera? And so what you can do is look at life cycle analyses, and they're compiling them from a number of data sets as well as the literature, and compare in these life cycle analyses how much are the emissions in the control and how much is in the addition of the residue. And this is per hectare farmland. And you can see that actually in the majority of them, there's greater amounts of net greenhouse gas emissions in the residue addition plots. And another important takeaway here is that this dashed line is telling you the amount the residue addition can offset. So it doesn't really go above these total emission lines. So you're not going to necessarily use this to get this alone to get to net zero. You have to reduce direct emissions as well. But it can contribute to potentially offsetting the differences between things like residue and control in some of the sites where there's less of a difference. And so there it would make sense to implement residue retention. So I want to circle back to the overall question of my talk. The first conclusion is that disturbances are important and it depends on their frequency, intensity, and where they're occurring, but they have the high potential to limit carbon dioxide storage in plants and soils. The second is that historically, over-disturbed systems have the greatest capacity for CO2 removal. We think this is especially the case in systems where there's been a lot of removal of plant biomass, like in intensively grazed areas. But it also opens the opportunity, I would say, to restore these areas that may have been less productive for producing food. And then finally, I think an area of really exciting research is needing to consider things like the life cycle of production to get at this net greenhouse gas emission reduction. And with that, I want to thank everybody. These are people that are involved in the projects that I was talking about. And then, of course, my awesome lab group. Thanks.
And I will open it to the audience. I'll let you pick on people.
Yeah. Yes, please.
So obviously I do a lot of work in forest restoration, so it's slightly different here, but we're collaborating with a project in like the Brazilian Atlantic forest, which is looking at doing like large scale forest restorations, like reconnected fragmented forests, and their like pasture is like the main land use that they're trying to like use for restoration. And the arguments they have there is that like at the moment the ranching is very, very low density, so they could easily like increase the density of like cattle ranching, like even by doubling it, it would still be quite low, and then it frees up land for restoration. I guess my question is there a way in which you could not just say, okay, we're going to keep the system as it is, we're going to intensify the ranching, but we're also going to, you know, within those rangelands and pasture areas that are we're going to intensify to free up land for tree planting, can we also do some stuff with soil carbon sequestration? Is there a world in which intensification of like grazing can also be done simultaneously with soil carbon sequestration, or is that just too much of an ask?
Well, I think a large part of it depends on how much the plant biomass inputs into the soils will change. I mean, if they're not increasing, or if they're not going to decline that much with intensification, you probably at least won't lose that much soil carbon. And there's been a lot of work showing that grazing can stimulate below ground biomass production if it's not too intense. I mean, you see that with like bison and with native herbivores in Africa. That's very different. But honestly, we weren't really looking in sort of the potential for intensification in an area. I mean, that's Rachel's that's Rachel's cup of tea. So I won't say anything stupid. But I think that from the soil carbon component, that may be an example where you just don't even think about soil carbon. See, like it's too complicated. We're not going to try to put a number on it.
So my thought on this is the question I was gonna save till later, but you characterized all of those places in the map as rangelands, but a lot of them are not necessarily rangelands. They're actually like way more, there's way more water, really well drained soils, and they're very, very good for agriculture actually. And this is where this intensification piece comes in. You can actually like wildly change I think both the soil carbon budget and the livestock productivity in those places, and flip that whole outcome you have in those areas, because you don't need to import any feed.
Yeah.
You produce it all right there. So I think if you just layered on a agricultural suitability map.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah, you'd get a very different picture. And all those places you're talking about also in the Atlantic forest are really good for.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, that's one thing that Robert's been thinking through is what are our assumptions around the distribution, what's a rangeland, et cetera. And I really think that there's definitely a lot, especially if you're doing like local level decision making, really refining that, like refining these types of numbers. One thing that is promising in rangelands in the Western US is when they have intensive grazing, if they also conduct prescribed burns, they're not intense. So you see a lot of return of plant biomass as pyrogenic into the soil. So that's one thing that I think is also potentially promising. Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I had a question about the increasing herbivory. I was wondering if there are also studies or evidence about if this effect on soil carbon is also showing in ecosystems which are more like closed canopy forests. I'm thinking specifically of a case in Taiwan where they are basically increasing grazing due to increasing sika deer populations. That's causing an obvious consequences on biodiversity. But I was wondering if the same can be said about soil carbon, or does this carbon cycling in the closed canopy forests different from the
herbivory from grazing for livestock in closed canopy forest, or are you talking about the elephants?
So it's more thinking about increased herbivory, whatever the species may be, but in the more closed canopy forest landscape. Has there been other case studies on that?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on what type of herbivores they are. If they're browsers, then they're reducing biomass turnover potentially to the soil, but you still get a load of carbon puts into the soil via roots production in that area. I mean, I could speculate, but I don't know any studies on that. The elephants will remove a forest, no problem. And these savanna woodland areas. I mean, even these are fever trees in Gorongosa, and as the elephant population has increased, they've really removed a lot of them. But that's a good thing in this area because the elephants were all killed.